Hi, everybody, and welcome to where you're tuning in from. I would really like to start by acknowledging, on behalf of Child Australia, the traditional owners and custodians of the country throughout Australia, recognising continuing connections to lands, waters and communities. We pay our respect to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander cultures and to elders past and present. And I would also like to acknowledge any Aboriginal or Torres Strait Islander peoples joining us today. At the end of this presentation, if there's time, we'll throw to a question and answers. But if there's not, we'll gather the questions as we go and we'll put the answers up there for you. If we run out of time for responses, we'll also send them through to you. And the recording will be provided to you at the end of this session, along with any resources that we have for you. I'd like to pass you over now to Tina.
Thanks, Connie. What I'd like to do is just frame up our reason for being here today and for having our panel members join us. So this webinar is largely to look at leading with pragmatic solutions, not to react and hope for the best. In the wake of what has been deeply distressing abuse cases across the country, there's enormous pressure to respond swiftly, but speed without strategy often leads to shallow fixes. So let's not try to be swept up in the tide of reactionary responses, but instead let's anchor the sector in evidence, clarity and strong leadership. The media and public are rightly concerned. I know that we've all been deeply distressed by what has unfolded recently, but some of the knee-jerk responses like blanket bans, banning male educators, increased CCTV surveillance without context, all of this thinking can actually do more harm than good to the very cultures that we're trying to build. We must never minimise the harm of abuse, but building whole system policy on the most extreme cases can really cause blind spots. So let's not miss the cultural silences that actually allow abuse to fester. What we need are proactive, robust frameworks that make every service, not just the problem ones, more accountable, more transparent, and more equipped to intervene early. What we're seeing is rising calls for crackdowns and zero tolerance policies, which is great, but without the investment in what actually works, the training, the supervision, the peer accountability, family partnerships, and psychologically safe work cultures. The child safe sector isn't just one where people are afraid to speak up, it's one where they're empowered to do so. Prevention is not a product of policy enforcement alone. It's the outcome of deliberate, embedded practice at absolutely every level. We know that leading national peak bodies have been advocating fiercely for some time now. Our colleagues at ACECQA, ECA, CELA have been shining a spotlight on several key reforms, and you can see some of those in front of you. Some of these around workforce solutions, professional development, increased regulator engagement across all the services, but really truly effective safeguarding strategies. In conversations and meetings across the country, I've said it numerous times that we've gone so far possibly into being compliance focused, and that definitely has a place. But somewhere along the line, all of the great work that was done, say 15 to 20 years ago, for those of us that have been around long enough, on protective behaviours, proactive protective behaviours training. All of it has just seems to have just disappeared along the way. At Child Australia, we know that policymakers, providers, professionals, all of us just really need to step up together. It's not a call out on just the issues, but let's model together what proactive safeguarding could look like. We've actually been on our own continuous improvement journey for some time now, and most recently we've launched our own campaign for our teams. We've called this the See It, Stop It, Say It campaign. And it's about engaging internal and external stakeholders and really making a strong commitment. It reminds us that each team member, partner, and family that child safety is an everyday responsibility. It signals to everyone that we're not actually going to just wait to be told what to do. We're all competent and capable, and we can actually do this while waiting for reforms to come online. Our campaign clearly shows our staff what concerning or high-risk adult behaviours look like. They're provided with key scenarios on what to do, how to have the conversation, and how to approach a situation. The key focus is that at the core of a proactive child safety culture, everyone's empowered. Educators need to be empowered with the language, they need to be equipped with the knowledge, and they need to have our support so that they can see it, stop it, and say it. We've launched this campaign as a declaration of our shared responsibility, but we know that real change takes more than organisational commitment. It takes a collective, coordinated effort across policy, regulation, practice, and community. That's why it means so much to us to have Minister Winton with us today. Minister Winton, our Minister here in WA, has shown a consistent commitment to early childhood education, to frontline educators, and most importantly, to listening. We're incredibly grateful that among the noise and the pressure, she's here to centre the voices that matter most for children and to those who care for them. So I'd like to introduce the Honourable Sabine Winton, Minister for Education, Early Childhood, Preventative Health and the Wheat Belt in Western Australia. With a background as a teacher for over 25 years and a strong track record in championing early learning and community wellbeing, Minister Winton brings deep insight and commitment to this important conversation. Welcome, Minister.
Thanks so very much, Tina. That's a lovely introduction, and it's a real privilege and honour to be able to participate in today's important webinar. And before I begin, I want to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land on which I'm sitting on today, and that of course is the lands of the Whadjuk people, and I pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging. I would also right at the outset like to thank and congratulate Child Australia, to you Tina and to Connie and the panellists for convening this important webinar, and also to welcome everyone who's taken time from their busy schedules to participate. You know, Tina, I almost really don't want to make any remarks because I think you actually summarised very clearly where we're at in this point in time, and I really, really welcome your approach. And the word that sticks out for me is pragmatic approaches rather than knee-jerk reactions. And it's really important that we firstly acknowledge the incredible work that happens each and every day with children right around Australia. And I want to also particularly acknowledge my state counterparts who I'm in constant conversations with, and of course our federal colleagues in Minister Clare and Minister Walsh, and certainly I look forward to convening with them later on next month, tomorrow's next month, on the 22nd of August, and that's why I really welcome the opportunity to participate and to listen fully to the voices of the people who know the sector the best and who get up each and every day with the purpose of keeping children safe. And we know that the safety of children is not negotiable, and we all know that. That's not in question. And we do, though, have to acknowledge these recent high-profile cases have not only shaken the public confidence, but laid bare some confronting truths. And those confronting truths are for government as much as that they are for the sector itself. But this conversation is so vital because all of us must lead that cultural shift towards prevention, accountability and a shared responsibility. And when we listen and look for paths forward to strengthen our systems, I consider you the experts who have the answers to help guide government in particular as it grapples with this. We're across Australia seeing a significant shift, whether it's from regulators to service providers to policymakers. The collective will to strengthen oversight, lift standards and close regulatory gaps is growing. And I see it as an opportunity to actually strengthen what already is a strong sector, despite what the media portrays. In Western Australia, of course, ECRU, known as the Education and Care Regulatory Unit, continues to take a firm stance when it comes to child safety, applying strong enforcement measures in response to serious incidents and publishing compliance actions to ensure transparency for families and communities. But we're not stopping there. You may know that I initiated a SNAP review of early childhood education and care services in WA, and that report is due to me shortly, and I'll be meeting with WA sector peaks in the next week or so to get their perspective. It's really important that I do that. But I also want to be able to continually highlight the important role that ECRU and our regulators play in enforcement, but more importantly, and Tina alluded to it, in terms of supporting the sector to strengthen its response. And pivotal to me is that support for professional learning and professional development. At a national level, of course, we welcome the Australian Child Safety Review, which is considering those critical updates to the National Quality Framework. And as I said, looking forward to heading over to Sydney in the next couple of weeks to meet with my Commonwealth and state counterparts to strengthen the national, to talk about further national reforms to strengthen child safety. Today's expert panel brings together voices from education, regulation, child protection and policy, and we're all focused on one shared goal, creating an even safer, and I like to use that word, I need to emphasise, our system is safe for children. We just need to make it even more safe for every child in every early learning setting across Australia. And it's not just a webinar, it's a space where practical evidence-based tools are going to be shared and a culture of proactive safety is advanced. Again, I thank Child Australia for showing this incredible initiative, leading by in this way. I know the feedback that I've had is that the response to this webinar has been incredible, which again demonstrates to me the incredible passion and determination for everyone within the sector to work towards our common goals. I thank you for your commitment to being open and positive and pragmatic and constructive in terms of what we all can do together to continue to increase the child safety and so that it continues to be visible, consistent and unwavering in our shared goals. I'm really looking forward to the conversation. I'll stop talking so I can start listening, which is the purpose of me being here today. Thanks so much, Tina.
Thank you so much for that, Minister. I would now like to introduce Michael Petrie. Michael represents ACECQA, the National Authority on Quality and Safety in Early Education. Michael, my question for you. As ACECQA recently released 2 child safety guidelines, can you take us through the key changes we can expect to see?
Thanks, Connie, and thanks to everybody online, and thank you for having me along today. It's certainly a privilege to be able to spend some time with everybody this afternoon. And I'd just like to acknowledge being in Sydney, the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation, where I'm currently sitting in quite cold and rainy weather, but it is a beautiful day in any event. The health, safety and wellbeing of all children who attend children's education and care services is obviously paramount, and the Minister just emphasised that, and everybody here knows that. And there has been and continues to be a significant amount of activity across governments to improve child safety, particularly across the NQF. On behalf of governments in 2023, ACECQA undertook a review of child safety under the NQF and proposed a number of recommendations as to how we could improve further what is, as the Minister again said, a very strong system of regulation. One of the things that we have done very recently, and as was just mentioned there by Connie in her question, released 2 child safety guides to assist the sector. And the guides mark a significant step in strengthening child safety practice across education and care services, building on the NQF, the national principles for child safe organisations, and state and territory child safety standards. The guides have been written to support educators, teachers and providers to recognise, prevent and respond to safety concerns, because as we all know, protecting children is everybody's business. The guides themselves are available on our website. So if you haven't had an opportunity to go and have a look at them, I would strongly recommend that you do so. They reflect obviously the recommendations from our child safety review, and they aim to move services beyond compliance to embedding child safety as a lived everyday experience. So please, if you do have some time, go and have a look at those guides. Just briefly, the other two main things that are happening moving forward, as many of you will be aware, and I hope you're all aware that from the 1st of September, there are going to be some regulatory changes, principally around the safe use of digital technologies and online environments. Your services will be required to have new policies and procedures in place to address those. There will be changes in the notification timelines for abuse incidents from 7 days to 24 hours, and there'll also be the prohibition of vaping substances. Now they'll come out on the 1st of September, and there will be communications obviously sent out prior to those commencing. There's also going to be further regulatory changes to the National Quality Standard from 1 January 2026, and they are refinements to quality areas 2 and 7. And again, there are a number of fact sheets out at the moment that articulate the specific changes that are going to be required there. The other things just to mention before I hand off to the next speaker, and the Minister mentioned this earlier, there are a number of other initiatives that governments are progressing at the moment, and at the request of Education Ministers, work is underway around the development of a national educator register. There is work being done at the Commonwealth level, and I think the legislation might have gone through Parliament today around strengthening the family assistance law so the Commonwealth can take greater actions around CCS with providers and services. And also, and I'll probably get onto this later in the session, a little bit more to be done around transparency of information for families and parents around the system and how it's operating. So a lot of work is being undertaken there. So I might just leave it there, Connie, if that's okay, for that particular question.
Thank you so much, Michael. Yeah. You've given us some great information there. So our next speaker is Kayleen Kerr, and I had the privilege of sitting in one of Kayleen's workshops on Sunday. So Kayleen brings to us deep expertise in child protection and law enforcement, particularly online and grooming behaviours. Kayleen, from your extensive experience in policing and as a child safety expert, what's a grooming red flag educators often miss, and how can they respond to this?
Yeah, thanks, Connie, and to Child Australia for the invitation and the opportunity to be with you and the other panellists today. I think I'd like to speak to that broadly and then more specifically. I wanted to acknowledge the amazing work that's being done in your sector, and for those of us that support your sector, we know that all of the time you're working very hard to keep children safe in all of the places and spaces they spend time, and your sector has been under enormous pressure in more recent weeks. So I wanted to speak broadly. The national principles and standards, the NQS, the EYLF, when we also look at child protection, mandatory reporting, non-mandatory reporting, when we look at reportable conduct schemes, we look at codes of conduct and codes of ethics, when we look at service values and the policies and procedures in these places that we work. What I'm going to say is, while all of those things are incredibly important, they're not going to be the things that in and of themselves keep children safe. If I had to distill it into easy to understand language, I always say that it is the practices of the people in the places where children are spending time that will keep them safe. And I want to also acknowledge that this is difficult when we're talking about child sexual abuse, and particularly those who offend against children via their profession. We know that in Australia, for the 1 in 10 Australian men that do have sexual feelings for children and who have offended against them, they are almost 3 times more likely to work with children. So So this presents a real challenge for those of us working in services. The environment and the opportunity that offenders have to commit crimes, though, can play a very pivotal role in whether they do happen or they don't happen. And so what we want to do in identifying grooming behaviours broadly is to increase the effort to offend in the places where our children are spending time. We want to increase the risk of detection. We want to increase the protective factors around children, and this decreases the risk factors. And to put this simply, we need to make sure that the practices of the people in these places are reflective and consistent with the policies for those places. And what I have found time and time again broadly, and oftentimes we can be looking at this days after something happens, weeks or months or years, is that oftentimes, because this can be complex and challenging for people in their workplaces, that what we tend to do when maybe we see something that is inconsistent with the policies and the procedures is we attempt to interpret them. We attempt to draw inferences from them. We attempt to interrogate them, and some people even try and investigate. And I'm going to say that's not your job. Your job is to report any behaviour that is inconsistent with the policies and the procedures. When you see something that you shouldn't be seeing, say something. But also, when you don't see something or you don't hear something that you should be seeing or hearing, we need to talk. And we can do that in a really collegial way as well. We can acknowledge that in your sector, about 40% have less than 3 years experience. We know that we have a workforce of about 25% of people that are casual staff, and you're looking after 1.5 million Australian children. So whether someone's been working in the sector for a long time or a short time, you know, we can always say, I'm not sure how you were trained. I'm not sure how things were done in the service that you worked at last week, last month or last year. But here, this is how we do things. This is the behaviour that is expected. This is the behaviour that's tolerated. And this is the stuff that isn't. So would you like me to show you what that looks like? Would you like me to model behaviours for you so that, that people feel supported? So I think that's speaking kind of broadly. What I wanted to say is incredibly difficult about child sexual abuse in any environment, including in early years education and care settings, is that offenders have diverse characteristics, diverse motivations, and diverse intentions. And unfortunately, why this is incredibly difficult is because those that seek to harm children, when you don't know their intentions or motivations, that is going to look like someone trusted in your service. That is going to look like someone who is capable, who is kind, who is helpful, that appears to have amazing knowledge. And what this does is it starts to, what we might do is start to dismiss things that were maybe a little bit suspicious, or we slowly over time have an environment that is now more conducive to harm occurring. So that is broadly speaking. Don't try and interpret people's behaviours. Report behaviours that are inconsistent with your policies and procedures. Be mindful of specific behaviours, like if your service has a policy that says you don't babysit children or for the families of this service, and that's in the policy, we want to make sure that people are adhering to that. We want to make sure that people are not treating specific children with favouritism or alienating some children. We want to make sure that if there's any physical contact between children and the adults that care for them, that it is child-led, it is not director-led. And we also want to make sure that we are mindful of the practices around things like nappy changes or assisting children with toileting, moving through spaces. Are there people that continually have patterns of a behaviour where they set up opportunities to be alone with children? And this can oftentimes actually come across as being like really helpful. If we have a policy already in our service that says no phones of a personal device in a space, then we need to make sure if someone is doing that, that we say something about it. There's lots of more specific behaviours that I could absolutely share, but I think looking at that sort of broadly and then a little bit more specifically, hopefully that's helpful for people.
Thank you so much, Kayleen. And Kayleen, I really love the way you make that approach to addressing our colleagues such a warm and welcoming way, just to address difference and the difference in the way in which we might do things. So thank you very much. I would now like to introduce to you Nicole Tallarico. And once again, Child Australia has been privileged on many occasions to have Nicole join us at our conferences. Nicole leads rapid response efforts and support services to embed safety through preventative practices. So a question for you, Nicole. From your quick response work, which lower level boundaries behaviours most often predict bigger concerns later, how can we get ahead of this?
Thank you, Connie, and thank you, Child Australia and fellow panellists for taking this time. I'm zooming in from Wurundjeri country or Teamsing in, or whatever the platform we're using. It's brilliant that we can be together to be able to share this really insightful, proactive approach. And I guess I like this question, Connie, because it doesn't matter what state or territory I am working in, there seems to be a pattern of behaviour when I actually finally get to engage in some work with a service that has been flagged in needing some intensive support. And so the first thing I want to say about that is some low-level behaviours that we really want to highlight and peter out, if you like, is I am constantly saying when something doesn't feel quite right, lean into that curiosity and make sure you speak to somebody, because the gut reaction is that can't be. Unfortunately, for those of us that work in this space, it's probably quite the opposite these days. Oh, yes, it can be. But for many educational services, their staff may want to sit on what they've noticed. And so if, this question can actually take two parts. It can be, what are some low-level behaviours that are perhaps noticed but not actioned in relation to children's behaviour amongst themselves, so peer-to-peer behaviours, but also too, we're really talking about human behaviours that we have to absolutely action and respond with intentionality. And as I say, yeah, we need to talk to somebody within our organisation and don't sit until we get further verification, because you may not. And so some of those low-level behaviours that perhaps might spark the attention of an educator could be anything to do with power imbalances. So any kind of play or dialogue between peers or between adults or educators and children that really looks off kilter, off balance. You may have secretive, some, in jokes that might only be between two or more people, rule breaking. And again, these are common with both children and educated to child communications or engagements that you might become a little concerned about. The disregard of personal space. So somebody that is always perhaps overstepping those boundaries and not listening or giving the other person an opportunity to be heard, and taking the cues from their body language to say, hey, this is a little bit close or a bit too much. Inappropriate discussions about body parts, physical contact. So it might be a bit of controlling or coercive, come this way, or you come with me. There could be a hyper-focused, a greater sense of attachment. And so these people are always together in the spaces and could very much be together in certain settings, particularly in the outdoor space or particularly during rest times or in the bathroom. Some cruel commentary can also be some of those low-level boundaries that are crossed and need to be actioned in the moment every time we notice these things. So how can we get ahead? Connie, there are lots of things we can do. You've already heard me say, absolutely don't wait. I love it when Tina emphasised the see it, stop it, say it. If you see it, even if you're not sure, we have to say something to stop it in the moment. It's those incidental moments that you don't expect where rich learning happens. Rich learning happens for children to realise, hey, I didn't particularly like that. And now my educator is stepping up to say, are you okay, Nicole? It didn't look like you were too happy with being dragged over here. And so we need to be attuned and alert when we're in our spaces working directly with children. We need to sometimes stand up and see it, stop it, say it, so that we can actually be the voice for children when they don't have the words sometimes, or often many times when things are not comfortable. We have to be really explicit in our onboarding with our families, with our staff, and with children. All stakeholders have to be a part of explicit onboarding and inductions to a service to say, these are the kind of behaviours and expectations that you will have and you will receive when you are engaged in our service provision. And this is how we look after you. This is how you are safe in this space. And that will also mean that we need to be quite open-minded and flexible in our approaches to sharing information. Are we always relying on verbal dialogue? Are we always relying on English versions of policies that are written? Do we have soft copies and hard copies? Do we have read easy versions that might also be translated language versions? Do we have audio versions? Do we have simplified versions that are directly age appropriate and stage appropriate for children to understand what to expect when they are at the service? So I guess all of that in a nutshell really comes down to speaking up and being explicit about our values, respect, consent, and how accessible the information is to everybody involved in a service. And if it's perhaps not so, let's create a stronger communication channels.
Thank you so much for that, Nicole. Nicole, I really take that low-level activities that are noticed but not actioned. And yesterday I was talking to some educators just about that and how difficult they actually find talking about those low-level activities and some things that they could do to practice speaking out about things that were perhaps a little bit easier. So thank you very much for that.
You're welcome.
I would now like to introduce to you Katie Brennan. Katie is a regulatory leader in the NT and brings deep insights from working with remote and regional services. Katie, I'd like to ask you what's working in the NT to keep children safe in very remote contexts? And is there anything we can do in other jurisdictions to implement similar strategies from tomorrow?
Thank you so much, Connie, and thanks for having me here today. I'll just acknowledge that I'm joining you today from the wonderful lands of the Larrakia Nation in Darwin. Look, it's a really valuable question that you've asked, and it's really important in the context of early childhood education care services, including our OSH services in remote and very remote context, that we give consideration to the unique circumstances of the remote community. We know, and as has been reinforced already today, that everyone has a role in keeping children safe. And you're likely here today because you understand and value that role and how you play in that regard. By promoting a child-safe culture, we're actually promoting child safety on a day-to-day basis. And for those joining us today from other states and territories, it might be interesting for you to know that there's actually no areas of the NT that are considered a major or inner regional area in line with the remoteness index. What this actually means is that the NT is the only jurisdiction Australia-wide where this is the case. That means the classification is largely defined because of the remoteness and accessibility and limited accessibility of essential services across the territory. What that means in practice for us is that 37% of our approved early years services are actually in remote or very remote areas. It means they have significant distances from accessibility and essential services that we often do take for granted or have forgotten when we're living in a major city. All that leads me to say is what's actually working in the NT in regarding to keeping children safe. What I've noticed in my context in the regulatory authority while working with the QEC&T team is that what we know is working well is a strengths-based, culturally grounded approach to child safety. What we know is that the core child safety begins with cultural safety. So by recognising and respecting the authority, the wisdom embedded in kinship systems, relationships, families, and community structures, we do support child safety. These systems have protected and nurtured our children for thousands of years, and we know and have found in the NT that the first step in the development of cultural safety is to consider this in context, in particular in Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander communities. What makes a practice difference is when services don't actually try and replace these systems, but instead partner with them, listening, learning, and building trust. In practice, this means working alongside each other, supporting local decision-making, and embedding cultural knowledge into every layer of the service. It's not actually just about delivering programs to communities, but enabling communities to lead. In response to that second part of your question, Connie, how can other jurisdictions implement similar strategies? I would actually implore the listeners today to reflect on and ask yourself a couple of questions. Whose voices are we centering our child safety systems on? Are we creating space for cultural authority and lived experience to guide our work? And are we investing in long-term relationships or just short-term outcomes? What we do know is that when we honour culture, we strengthen safety. And the strategies aren't quick fixes. We all know and we've heard today that there's more to do. However, we can start by building and embedding partnerships with our families, with community support, and recognising and valuing child safety long term. We can ensure that our decisions and actions maintain and continue to be grounded in respect and patience. And if we tie this back to Standard 2.2 of the National Quality Standard, which we're all pretty familiar with, each child is protected, we know and we can ensure that we continue to reflect on how we actively engage and ensure that our practice is meaningfully shaped by engagement with families and communities at all times. This will support a service's success regardless of what location you're operating from. And we do know that early childhood services work connectedly with schools, clinics, community services, and more, and it takes a village to raise a child. And this is absolutely applicable in an early years context. So to wrap up my response to this question, I certainly acknowledge that it's important to note that there is more work to be done to ensure that children are always safe, and we continue to build a culture where everyone works together to contribute to child safety. And the national conversations that we're having in this regard will go to strengthen those outcomes for children in all contexts. Thanks, Connie.
Thank you so much, Katie. And I love that message, and that's going to be one of my biggest take homes. And it's important for so many reasons. Core safety is embedded in cultural safety, and whose voices are we capturing? Do we value community leaders? Thank you very much for that. I'd now like to introduce to you Lauren Bowen from ECRU. Lauren is a regulatory unit leader in WA, driving data-informed safeguarding across the state. Lauren, my question to you, can you share how ECRU currently utilises incident and breach data to provide proactive support, and what next steps could further strengthen that approach?
Thanks, Connie. And thank you very much for inviting me to be part of this very important conversation. And I think everybody is highlighting how important safety is for children and for the sector, particularly now. There's a lot of conversation about that. Look, ECRU, as a regulatory authority, the data is really important as a tool to support us and help us to determine regulatory priorities and inform that compliance monitoring focus for us. So to give you an example, over the past 2 years, we've seen a 23% increase in non-compliance of Section 165, which is an offence to inadequately supervised children. And we've also seen a 20% increase in non-compliance of Section 167, which is an offence relating to the protection of children from harm and hazards. So seeing those sorts of trends and patterns of increased non-compliance, it helps us to determine what those priorities are and amend some of our tools and our approach to monitoring compliance in the sector. So ECRU has developed compliance monitoring checklists, which are used by our authorised officers to go out and assess the compliance of services in relation to those sorts of areas. And we've recently made changes again. We've done that for the past couple of years, using the data to inform that focus and make changes to what it is our officers are actually looking at and assessing when they're out in the sector. And we publish those checklists for everybody. So they're available publicly. And we do that as part of a transparent approach to that assessment. And we really hope that services and providers will be using the same tools that we are to assist them to basically self-audit and manage the compliance from within their services. It's incredibly important, particularly around those areas I mentioned, around supervision, about safety and protection of children, to ensure that those measures are proactive and that services aren't waiting to be found non-compliant before they take measures to protect children. But those are things that we proactively check, and it allows us to include those specific focuses on those identified areas of risk. So the data is really important in highlighting what it is that we're seeing in terms of what we're finding services aren't able to comply with consistently. Look, we are constantly sharing information with the sector. I think that transparency is a really important part of sharing that compliance data. So we have monthly sector publications that go out where we are sharing quarterly top 10 non-compliance areas in the sector in WA to again prompt a little bit of reflection and hope that services and providers are looking at their own practice and considering how they do those things for themselves to maintain compliance at their service and in turn keep things safe for children. We're also releasing compliance bulletins and media statements as an opportunity to increase awareness about, non-compliances, particularly those high-level concerning non-compliant situations, so that people can learn from those. They can learn from previous incidents and understand what the implications are from a safety perspective for children. In terms of what next steps we can take to strengthen that approach, we will continue to engage with the sector. It's a very big part of what we do. We already meet with the larger providers on a very regular basis, and we're very responsive to requests to engage with providers and services and provide clarification. We ultimately want to ensure that the sector is connected to all of the relevant people, the sector, the subject matter experts that will help them to understand that. And we've done that in the past through basically engaging with some of the providers. We recently, a couple of years ago, we were working with subject matter experts around burns because we were seeing a trend in burns in services where children were touching very hot things and being exposed to heat in ways that was very dangerous to them. So we've been able to pass on that information and that learning, and we've got resources available at our website that will support services to implement practices that create safer spaces for children. So we're going to continue to do that. We are in the process of planning our 2026 ECRU Roadshow. So we've had some success with those in the past, and there will be quite a strong focus on child safety for that roadshow. So in all, ultimately that data becomes a really important tool to drive our focus in terms of assisting the sector to better understand the requirements of the legislation and how that serves to keep children safe. We intend to continue to do that, and we will be developing more tools and examples, risk assessment example templates to support the sector to implement the practices that they need to consistently keep children safe.
Thank you so much for that, Lauren. Lauren, I like that idea of using those checklists for people to do a little bit of a critical reflection on what they're doing well and where, areas that they could improve. Also, let's look out for that 2026 roadshow. All right, we have now some further questions for our panelists, and Michael, I'd like to start with you. And I want us to think about the National Quality Framework. What enhancements can ACECQA consider to move services from being compliant on paper to ensuring embedded and life safety practices? I have another couple of questions for you, but if you could start with that one, that would be great.
Sure, Connie. I'll be relatively brief on this one, and I think what we can provide at ACECQA in this space is a continued provision of advice and resources to the sector to help them in this regard. And we mentioned earlier around the child safety guides and what is happening there, but we do offer a lot of valuable tools and resources to support services and their teams to improve their child safety practices. We have reflective practice guides to help educators and leaders examine their approaches in pedagogy, self-assessment tools, case studies and examples to illustrate how child safety can be embedded in everyday practice, national quality standard resources, especially around Quality Area 2, children's health and safety. And these include a risk assessment management tool and templates for managing risk. We have also a range of infographics and videos that can help services in that space. We've talked around, and that's just about bringing the theory into practice. And I think that one of the things that has been touched on is how important that is, but also it's also important for new educators coming into our system who have come out of a qualification style environment with a lot of theory, and then how do you translate that into practice? So I think a lot of the resources there will assist with that. And we've already talked about the child safety guides, but we are doing some more work around on behalf of the Australian government around inclusive practice frameworks to strengthen the capability of services to embed inclusive practices and better support children and families experiencing barriers to access and participation. And I know that Child Australia have been involved in some of that work to date, so I just do want to thank Tina and her team for that. Separately, there are resources that we've also done around DDA, Disability Discrimination Act resources, and perhaps more direct work that we have done across the country with specific programs in different jurisdictions to help the uplift of quality practice, particularly focused on working towards services. So there has been a range of work that we've done to try and shift the practice from theory into reality, but also lift the quality across the sector. So again, a lot of that work is, and examples of demonstrations of that work is on our website. So I would again encourage people to go and have a look.
Thank you for that, Michael. My next question is actually about families and how might we better support them through platforms like startingblocks.gov.au to understand escalation pathways and red flags?
Yeah. Really important point, particularly in the current context, Connie. And for those of you that aren't aware of Starting Blocks, Starting Blocks is our family-focused national website. So that it currently includes all the information around the NQF quality ratings, where services are, fees, vacancies, CCS. I'm sure a number of your services, if you're out there, would be familiar with it, or at least I thank you for the information you put into the various systems that drive Starting Blocks, and that's a free service for all families across the country, and that is information that's updated on a daily basis. So it's as up to date as we can all get it across the regulatory systems across the country. In terms of families, we are very focused on trying to improve and provide as much information for families as we can to help in their decision-making processes. And you would have recently heard the federal ministers, all ministers, in June ask for a greater level of transparency to be provided to families, and probably twofold to talk about there. There is transparency and information for parents as they are searching for a service. So things like Starting Blocks come into play. And then there's the information that parents who have their children in a service should expect to see and be provided by the service themselves around their assessment and rating, quality rating, changes to that rating, and compliance information around any action or any breaches that have been issued to them by the regulator. So there's that two components. On the Starting Blocks website, we have principally always focused on NQF and the assessment and rating and the quality rating as the benchmark for how the system is going. We are, at the request of ministers, going to start looking at how we can build a little bit more in compliance information for parents into starting blocks. One of the first things that we will be doing is to look at better linkages between the service and who the provider is of that service moving forward. We already have some linkages with services and large providers, but we'll start to do that with services and all providers. We'll start to look at trying to better inform parents around the work of the regulatory authority, particularly around the visits they undertake. At the moment, as I mentioned, the ANR visit date is really the sole barometer of the expectation publicly that that's the only time the regulator has ever been to see a service, which we all know on this line is not correct. RAs do 4 times as many compliance and monitoring visits as they do assessment and rating visits. So to help paint that picture of safety for parents, that the RAs are looking at services, we'll start to look at the last visit date and publish that on starting blocks, and also try to provide a little bit more information to parents around the conditions that have been placed on a service and the provider. So we're working towards how we can start to promote that through starting blocks over coming months. Separately to that, there is perhaps a lot of information that parents could be provided, but we're trying to work through what is really relevant for parents moving forward, particularly around enforcement actions that have been undertaken at a service, rather than just every time that they have been issued a notice or whatever it might be. So we're just working through the balance act between the important information that parents need to know to help them make decisions before they go to a service versus those that are there but are not necessarily going to help them have a clear picture of what's happening in the service. So a little bit of work to be done there, but it's certainly something that we're working hard on over the coming months.
Thank you, Michael. And briefly, in relation to workforce data and stakeholder work, what trends are most concerning to safeguarding culture and educator readiness, and how can providers get ahead of this? Really
pertinent question, Connie, and I could talk about this for another 45 minutes if you'd like me to,
yeah,
but I don't
absolutely.
think anyone wants me to talk about this for 45 minutes.
Yeah.
But in summary, I think staff burnout, low sense of well-being are issues that have been pertinent in the sector for quite a while. Recent issues are not going to help that. The other thing is inconsistent pre-service training and high staff turnover is an ongoing problem, and obviously that has a direct impact on child safety. So there is a lot of work being done, and by governments, and you would have seen different regulatory authorities, not just in regulatory systems, not just in early childhood, but associated to us, looking at various parts of what feeds into our sector. ACECQA, the Skills Quality Authority, is looking at the quality of vet courses and graduates coming out of vet courses. HECSA, who looks after the university sector, are looking at the provision of graduates coming out of particular institutions and particular qualifications that are coming out across the sector as well. You've also got governments have asked, the Australian government has asked human ability to review the Certificate 3 and diploma, the national training package, and that will start to occur. And I think you'll find governments will be looking to strengthen the components in those packages around child safety and child protection, not especially given the environment we are in. So that process is underway. And I think from a professional development, just in summary, a professional development point of view, I think that's a really important aspect for providers to provide and mentor staff in their services. And we had seen, I think the last National Workforce Census saw an uptick in full-time staff that are undertaking professional development, which is a really good thing. It's certainly higher than it was 10 years ago in terms of the numbers, but there is more to do. And certainly that's an area where the focus is going to be moving over coming years.
Thank you so much for that, Michael. That's been really insightful for everybody. Now I'd like to bring back Nicole Tallarico. So Nicole, I have a couple of questions for you. First one is, you work very, very closely with early learning services. If you could change one policy clause that routinely causes confusion or inaction in services, what would that one policy be?
Oh, it's tricky.
I have got two questions for you though, Nicole. 2 questions.
All right. Do you want me to answer this one before you ask me the next one?
Answer that one first.
Okay.
That one first.
Okay.
Thank you.
Look, this was a tricky one because there's a couple of things that I would have wanted to suggest, but what I'm going to, my go-to is going to be the code of conduct. That policy and the points often in services codes of conduct caused great confusion, because what is often missed is, and so perhaps it should be looking at renaming it to code of misconduct, so that we don't forget that it's really important to highlight what will not be acceptable and what will be the likely consequences of breaching a code of conduct. Because when that's not clear, things are not addressed and we don't respond in a timely manner to them when inappropriate conduct occurs.
Yeah, I like that, code of misconduct. And what are the consequences? Absolutely. So moving on from that, what are 3 observable behaviours or routines that signal a strong safeguarding culture, not just policy? So it's the enactment of those policies.
Yeah, absolutely. And I'm really passionate about this because it's our everyday actions that we do in our spaces that determine that strength of culture of mitigating harm to children. Yeah. So I think for 3 things that I would like to bring up here is that when educators have a really strong communication process and protocols, and it's almost like they're narrating what they are doing in the space. It means that they are adhering to a very flexible, active approach to supervision. And, I really like to use the term dynamic supervision because it means that we can have set areas in mind, but we need to make sure that we have a wide scope of line of sight. But it also means that we can be quite responsive in the moment to better meet the needs of children. So we're going to be seeing educators communicating to fellow team members or calling for extra assistance so that we maintain a really high quality of supervision in our spaces. The second thing that I think is also great behaviour to see when I'm out and about is a range of ways that children can raise concerns and call for help and assistance. We rely very heavily on children being able to verbalise that they need assistance, but when we're actually quite open to varying ways that can be done, and we're also wanting to empower children, I love seeing educators encouraging peer advocacy. So you can step up and speak and be present for your friend. You can actually raise concerns on behalf of your friend. We know that children share a wealth of information peer-to-peer as opposed to child to educator. And I think the third thing that I think really does help to raise that practice level of quality is when you're seeing children actively involved in risk assessment. And that means we use a range of multimodal ways to talk to children about measures in place to keep them safe, listen to what their ideas are and respond with actions in terms of what their ideas are, so that we're really extending that idea of rights to privacy when we're going out and about and before visitors come into a space. Children should be part of that process and the thinking around mitigating harm.
I really, really like that, Nicole. How do we involve children in safe spaces and working out what those are? That real involvement and, really supporting that sense of agency that we want children to have around what's good for them and what is not good for them.
Yeah.
Thank you so much, Nicole. Kayleen, I'd like to invite you back now, and I have 2 questions for you. You ready?
I'm ready.
Great. Question 1. Educators often feel unprepared or underprepared to lead protective behaviour conversations. Where should they start? What's the one piece of training or scripting that makes the biggest difference to them?
Yeah, Connie, thanks. That's a really great question. And I just wanted to make an observation before I go into that, that really highlights the importance of building that capacity within our services. Is one of the concerns that I have that I'm a little worried that we get so focused on in all of these discussions is it tends to be focused on how do we make sure that adults and services are free from liability and litigation. So much of the focus tends to be on the behaviours of adults, which is very important. But one of the things that I'm concerned about is that this actually means that maybe we're not actually embedding the pedagogy of safety and a culture of safety. And why this, I think, is so important that we also make sure we're leaving space to look and really, like Nicole was saying, be observant of the children in our space is this. For the 1 in 3 girls in Australia and the 1 in 5 boys, almost 1 in 5 boys that will experience sexual abuse before they're 18 years of age, only 2% of those children are actually abused in an institutional setting, and only 0.7 in an educational space like early years. Now, the reason I mention this is because most of the children that are in your services that are harmed will be harmed in families, in communities, and in other places. And also, we know that there are more children displaying harmful sexual behaviours in early childhood education and care services. So we need to make sure that we are building staff's knowledge, their competence, their comfort in having these conversations. And the best thing I could say is staff don't know what they don't know. And when you know better, you can do better. We need to support them to be confident, competent, comfortable, and they have to feel supported in their service and by their service. And I think one of the key ways that we do this is encourage staff to know that protecting children from harm is a shared responsibility. There is a role and a responsibility for all of us. And that, how does that look in practice? Think globally and then act locally. Concentrate on the difference that you can make in the life of one child. Lean into the education, lean into equipping them with skills and strategies. Also empower them. We need to protect them, and we also need to support them as well. We need to do this. We need to focus on the children, and we have to acknowledge that for many adults, this is hard. It feels hard because we grew up in homes and spaces where this wasn't modelled for us. These conversations weren't had. And as I said, I think a lot of people don't know what they don't know. And thankfully, there's lots of people in this amazing sector that are there to support them.
Very important messages there, Kayleen. My second question to you is actually about families. So partnering with families on this journey is really critical. How do you suggest that providers and families do this respectfully without creating the unnecessary fear?
Yeah, I think that collectively and collaboratively and in partnership, we all need to learn more about the prevalence, the nature, the impact of child sexual abuse, how it happens, when it happens, physical and behavioural indicators. There's a whole lot that we can learn. And I think one of the most important ways to do that is to make sure that this is in our key documents in a service. It's in part of our staff induction, but it's also part of our family induction. For example, we can say that in this service, whenever we do a nappy change or we talk to children, we use the correct terms for the private parts of the body. And then you invite that conversation with families. You manage any of the objections that may come up. We want to make sure that with families, they also know what's happening, what we're doing, how we're doing it, what resources we're using to support that, and importantly, the resources that they can use to continue those conversations at home. home. And we've got to make sure, like, services know your children, your families. Your education, your conversation and your partnership needs to be inclusive and tailored to your context. It needs to be culturally sensitive. It needs to ensure that we're capturing children with learning difficulties and differences and disabilities, and always looking at the ways that we can continually review what we're doing, celebrate your successes, integrate this into and across learning areas. I would much rather, as we spoke about on Sunday, Connie, I would much rather see 1,000 1-minute conversations over time as opposed to one mat session where when the kids get up, we don't continue those safety conversations.
Absolutely.
So, yeah, and we've just got to make people feel like, this is really hard and it feels hard, but you can do this. We've all got this.
Yeah, we can all do hard things. All right. Thank you for that, Kayleen. Very insightful. Katie Brennan, I'd like to bring you on now to ask you a couple of questions. So, Katie, I'll ask you the questions one at a time. So the first question is, can you share how QECNT used incident data to guide proactive supports for providers?
Yeah, absolutely. Look, it's an important question. That's something that my team as a regulatory authority think about quite often. And we know that taking a proactive approach supports and guides providers and ensures that every decision that we're actually making does mean that children remain the centre of all of our decisions. Building on the foundations of how QECNT and all regulatory authorities operate nationally, we're guided by the principles and the objectives of the National Quality Framework. We really do focus on ensuring that the safety, health and wellbeing of children and promoting that continuous improvement is tied to all of the work that we're doing and all decisions that we're making. And this includes using incident data to guide our support. Now, using this data helps us to ensure that our actions are informed by a risk-based, proportionate approach to any decisions that we make, and child safety remains at the forefront. We're actually finding that providers and services in the NT specifically are now more aware of their reporting obligations than ever before. This could be due to the media coverage, the sector spotlight right now, or maybe it was simply an upwards trend that would have occurred anyway. In the NT, for context, we've actually had a 46% increase in incident reports from the same time last year, from January to July, compared to this year. Why is it happening? Is it due to more incidents actually occurring, or was the sector just underreporting before, and now that they're more aware of who we are, we're getting those notifications through? So we know either way that the increase in incident data actually allows us to capture more trends than ever before, and then we can use this to support improved practice for every provider and service and ensure that every child has access to a high quality, safe early years experience. How we're doing this is actually in a few different ways. Through my team, we've established internal processes where the team connect regularly. We discuss trends from our incidents, our complaints and our visits, and we update our QECNT webpage. Now, this might seem really basic in nature at its first point, but what we've actually found is it gives our stakeholders in the NT a very quick source of truth for the trends in the NT, and we've heard how useful it is for people to know where to look for NT context. It is important to know that this information is not just about sharing the trends of the actual breach itself, but it is more about actively ensuring that we're providing that guidance on how to rectify the breach, that we're giving that information on the information sheets, the templates, and further details on how to support the services and the providers. We also visit our services regularly, and we connect in person to provide that direct guidance to make sure we're monitoring the services in line with the NQF. If there's been a recent incident, the authorised officer goes out prepared with that information. They talk to the service about reflections on practice and what they've learnt and what they've been able to put in place since that incident. Another thing that we do, and ECRU mentioned before, is actually have regular meetings with our approved providers. As a smaller jurisdiction in the Northern Territory, we don't have as many services, so we actually regularly meet with all of our large providers who have 5 or more services. And this allows time for the QECNT leadership team and the provider team to come together and actively reflect on trends and specific information related to them and their services. It actually makes sure that our feedback is purposeful and meaningful. And in doing so, we're actually taking proactive action to support the approved provider and ensure that there's a transparency of decision making between us as the regulator and them as well. We've had really good feedback about the benefits of these connections, and I certainly do acknowledge that although we have many challenges in the NT being a small jurisdiction in size and in regulatory staff, this context actually means that we have really strong relationships with our approved providers, and this really is essential to the success of actually building high quality early years in the NT. We know that being proactive is often considered a second thought for a regulator, and we know all too well how much time gets taken up by the reactive work, responding to critical incidents and changing deadlines. And I certainly don't take for granted in leading this team that the proactive work is where our best reflection takes place, and being proactive is where our meaningful learning and development occur. And we certainly know that we can actually learn to be moving beyond compliance when we embed that culture of high, safe and quality childhood practices at all times.
Excellent. Thank you for that. I'm just thinking about collaboration there, Katie. And can you share any lessons from cross jurisdictions where you've had seen the impact of some of those collaborations?
Yeah, absolutely. So we do obviously engage with a large number of stakeholders and cross agencies across a number of areas, including through critical issues. And it's really important that we learn and grow from these to build on the success of the work that we do. In terms of from regulatory authorities, we are strongly supported by ACECQA and meet regularly with all jurisdictions. We come together for a wide range of purposes to work together to share outcomes, drive improvement and learn from each other. This can often include specific meetings around investigations, assessment and rating, communication strategies and policy and more. When there's critical issues that arise, cross-agency collaboration is really vital, and we do this by connecting with the other agencies as required pending the circumstances. And in a critical incident, that information sharing, often between police, a working with children agency or WorkSafe agency, is a real pivotal part of ensuring that child safety remains at the forefront. We know for us, our prime goal remains ensuring the safety, health and wellbeing of children are paramount to all of our decisions. Critical issues are certainly not something we want to deal with, but even as the regulatory authority, it is something that we do have to manage from time to time. And then working through these must come with a measured approach. So as the regulatory authority, we actively try and learn and reflect on each critical incident, and we actively consider our approaches to ensure that our objective remains the safety of children. An example of this cross-collaboration and learnings would be a critical incident that QECNT had that involved the police directly. Prior to the incident, our connections with police were functional, but there'd been limited reasons for us to really connect with them before to have that deep understanding of our roles and responsibilities. And what I mean by this is that prior information sharing occurred, but it perhaps wasn't as seamless as we would like. So through a critical incident that occurred, we started establishing regular ongoing communication, information sharing in line with our legislative provisions, and we were able to clearly establish some lines of communication, some clarity of responsibility, and maintain both of our legal requirements. We as a team reflected on this after the incident, and we've actually now established really clear information sharing protocols with police as a result. Now, this actually allows our authorised officers to use their legislative powers under the national law to seek information in a quick manner, and it's well received by police and can guide our decision making when required. So we know that finding learning in a critical incident is often really challenging, and actively reflecting on the impact that that had and how we can now use that learning to impact further serious incidents is knowing that we've actually learned from that and it's more seamless than before. So a key reminder and a lesson here for us was that communication was the central purpose of child safety that drove our outcome. And we know and continue to learn that practical solutions do build on stronger systems through that shared responsibility that actually ensures that protecting children remains at the heart of everything that we do.
Thank you, Katie. Your message at the beginning was that children are at the centre of all the decisions you make. And that example of communication, working with the police, really highlights that for us. So thank you very much. I'd now like to bring Lauren back. Lauren, I have a couple of questions for you. So the first one is, beyond compliance data, what indicators could providers track to identify red flags around child safety issues?
Great question. Yeah, look, I think the first thing I would say is don't wait for the regulatory authority to identify those compliance red flags for you. Ultimately, there's an onus here on approved providers to have really robust systems in place to identify those things for themselves. And compliance is a minimum standard. We're always aiming for best practice, and particularly when it relates to child safety, minimum standards and best practice should pretty much align. Ultimately, I would suggest that there are a range of tools and strategies that some providers already have in place, but can always be reflected upon and made more robust. But ultimately, it's about developing and maintaining systems to monitor how service practices are keeping children safe. Specifically, that service policies and procedures are both understood by the people who are meant to be implementing them, and that they are actually being consistently followed and implemented to ensure that the children are safe. And when those gaps and risks are identified through monitoring processes, that providers are taking that prompt action to mitigate the risks to children. So I think there's a range of tools and I guess indicators that can be used, and certainly a range of publications. So ACECQA obviously have published a number of tools, including their self-assessment tool, that will help services at a very basic level to understand that they're maintaining compliance, which is again that minimum standard for safety, and then we should be seeing those sort of manifest into services quality improvement and continuous improvement planning. So the process of self-assessment, whilst it is part of a quality improvement process, it speaks to meet the minimum standards first. Safety should be the minimum standard. So looking at and reflecting on practices on a regular basis will really be the best tool for any service or provider to identify those gaps in their practice, and where there are red flags popping up. They won't be the big red flags. Hopefully they're going to be little things that can be addressed as they occur, because that's the second part of the process, is that where you do have those great processes in place to monitor practices and make sure everyone is doing what they should be doing, that if you do identify things, you have to take prompt action. You don't leave it sitting there as we'll get to that when we have time, but because it all comes together at some point to highlight the importance for children. As I said, there are lots of tools and audits. I would encourage services and providers to consider completing a child safe organisation audit. That will help highlight some of those red flags if there are any. And certainly I think that the pattern of complaints and incidents that are occurring at services should be used to inform action in the same way. So if you've seen a change in those patterns, if you're identifying more complaints, you're seeing more incidents occurring, then there should be a prompt there for further reflection as a team, and reaching out to those complainants and using that information to really understand what's changed or what needs to change to support that safety. You also need to consider those matters that maybe fall outside of the scope of the national law, which is including things like matters that fall under the WA Ombudsman Reportable Conduct Scheme, and we've already touched on the mandatory reporting. So those all they overlap. But ultimately, it's about identifying what's happening at the service that contributes to those things. I guess the last thing I would say in regards to that is that annual performance reviews with educators, with staff, are a really valuable opportunity to identify the gaps in that educator knowledge. And I think we've talked a bit about that. We don't know what we don't know. So by identifying what people don't know, it particularly with their understanding regarding child safety matters, you can use those as an opportunity to determine what investment needs to be made in their professional development to support child safety.
Yeah. Thank you, Lauren. It's a really good point that you make where you say don't wait for the regulatory authority to tell you what you need to do. You actually know what you need to do, get into action and be proactive. My second question there is, how do you see state and territory regulations working together over the next 12 months to create more consistent safeguarding expectations for providers operating across borders?
Yeah, look, I think we've probably talked a little bit to this already, and some of the other panelists have certainly commented on some of these things. But Obviously, the Child Safety Review is a big part of what we're doing nationally, and working together and consulting with both regulatory authorities and the sector with regards to what are the most important recommendations that we need to pursue with regard to child safety. And that's obviously been happening for longer than we've been seeing the more recent issues in the sector. So the implementation of those recommendations, including the strengthening of the legislation, is going to be a big part of all jurisdictions working together to improve those safeguarding expectations. We are already working together with the Australian government to develop the National Educator Register, and there will be a significant impact, I imagine, with the development of that register. And then, of course, and we've already heard about this today, but from the 1st of January 2026, seeing those refinements of the National Quality Standard, that's going to really sharpen the focus on child safety in those quality areas 2 and 7. There will be, for some time now, and has been for a while now, an ongoing focus on child safety across all states and territories. So those meetings that Katie referred to continue to happen. They have always been in place, but the focus being on child safety matters will continue, and we will, I guess, continue to engage in those really robust conversations, listening to the sector about what's needed and what we can implement, both separately in each jurisdiction and together nationally.
Thank you, Lauren. I'd just like to address our audience for a moment. Just want to say that we probably will go over a little bit of time, and I'd like to thank everybody for their patience. We really do understand if people need to leave. Just a reminder that you will get the full recording of this next week. So if you need to leave, it's okay. You'll get to hear everything we say. I'd now like to bring on Georgie Dent. Georgie is the Executive Director of Parenthood, representing the voices of over 75,000 parents across Australia. Wow, that's a huge reach. So, Georgie, I have a couple of questions for you. The first one is, what structural or policy shifts do you believe would meaningfully empower families to raise safety concerns earlier before they're escalated or before they escalate?
Yeah, look, thank you for having me on. And that is a really good question. And I think that it's important to just acknowledge that the allegations of abuse and the sort of the reports over the last couple of weeks, I know, have been deeply, deeply distressing to early educators, to early childhood teachers, to anybody who works in this sector.
Absolutely.
The vast majority of whom are in it for the right reasons and do incredible work under demanding circumstances. And I want to acknowledge that. And at the same time, I have to acknowledge that these allegations and sort of reports have really rattled parents and families. And I can say, sort of hand on heart, I've been running the Parenthood for 5 years, and we do campaign for high quality, inclusive early childhood education and care that's delivered by a professionally paid and supported workforce. And I have never, in the time that I've been advocating in this space, I haven't had communication from parents like I have over the last couple of weeks. And I think that it's so difficult to acknowledge this, but trust in early learning has really been shaken. And one of the things that we've been really focused on at the Parenthood is trying to be reassuring where that's warranted, because we do know that there are lots of services that are high quality, and that this is not it's not the case that we need every single parent who has a child participating in early education care to be panicked. But equally, I think we're now in this spot where parents are feeling uneasy about leaving their children in early education and care in ways that they weren't even just a few weeks ago. And probably the most difficult aspect of the recent reporting, from my perspective, for us at the Parenthood, has been the communication from parents who have disclosed to us incidents that have been unacceptable in early education and care. And there's a spectrum, of course, and we have had, communication and dealings with families who have had the sort of most extreme violations occur, and obviously that is horrific. But we've also just had we've had a high volume of email messages from parents who have had uncomfortable experiences. They've had sort of children being handled roughly, and I think that's probably where I think there's this real need to sort of create a partnership between parents and families and early childhood education and care services, so that, you know, and we know that in best practice, that's how it works. You know, there is a really strong relationship between the parents, the educator, and the child. But when we talk about the sort of structural shifts that would meaningfully empower parents, I think, in my view, so much of it sort of starts and ends with the workforce. So the extent to which the early educators are being well supported, that they've got appropriate qualifications, that they're in an environment where their profession is recognised and supported. And I think that we do have to accept that there are services where educators are in positions where that is not what they are able to do. They can't partner with parents and children on improving that experience and that environment and the quality of their experience there. And I think that's where, from a structural perspective, things like high quality qualifications and appropriate professional pay, they're the sort of structural things. I can't see a way through this moment, or I haven't been able to see a moment. You can't envisage a high quality early childhood education and care system without envisaging a high quality, strong, sustainable, well supported workforce.
Yeah.
And I think, so I'm sort of speaking all over the place, but I think in terms of structural mechanisms, we need to look at, you know, a workforce strategy that recognises where we are and where we want to be, and has a plan to plug those gaps. And so we make sure we are supporting the educators who we have, and we're making sure that there's not a place for, you know, people that don't have suitable qualifications being able to sort of run around and work in 100 different services. That's just not the system that we need, because we know that in that sort of system, the risk to children is greater. I think that there's also, I'm really reluctant to lean into some of the sort of knee-jerk reactions. And I have to say, we have had a lot of parents who've been in touch with us expressing their concerns around things like CCTV, which I've been heartened by, because I think that it has shown to us that parents really do recognise that CCTV is an expensive tool, and that if it is going to be used appropriately and well, so that data is kept as safely as it would need to be, that's very, very expensive. And most parents recognise what we recognise, which is, if you are going to be investing in any additional resourcing in any early learning service, it has to be in the educators or the teachers, in their professional development, their qualifications, their training, not a data IT person. And so I think that, having said what I've said about, I don't think this is the moment for knee-jerk reactions, I do think that we're at a point where we need to be doing quite a lot of things all at once, and some of them are more simple and straightforward. So I think things like an educator register, and in some way being connected to that, something like a complaints hotline of some kind, because one of the things we took a couple of families to meet with the Education Minister and the Early Education Minister in Canberra last week, and they were some of the families that have had the most extreme examples of abuse occur to their children in early learning. And for each of those families, there were legitimate red flags with the perpetrators that had been raised in prior settings, which they didn't know about at the time. And each of those parents actually raised concerns with the centre directors, and they were dismissed. And then later they found out there were other educators that had raised the red flag. And you think we need to have some form of anonymous, clear complaint pathway, I think, for parents and for educators, because I think what we have heard is we know there are environments where, for whatever reason, educators are not feeling able to speak up. And I think there's information that needs to be, it doesn't mean every complaint needs to be acted upon in an aggressive way, but I think that we need some sort of mechanism like that that will give parents some confidence that there is an ability for information about early childhood educators to be known, not in a sort of, not breaching privacy, but I think children are incredibly vulnerable. We know that, particularly in those early years. And I think we need to recognise some of the measures that are needed to restore confidence as much as the measures that are needed that are going to actually embed quality. I am a firm believer that we cannot regulate our way out of this. We need to be building quality into every single service.
Yeah. Georgie, that makes me think about family inclusive safeguarding cultures. What do you think that would look like in everyday practice?
Look, I think that what it means is, I want to say daily, but I think the point is like open, frequent communication between parents and educators. It means, you don't have to have a formal once a year get together. Not that necessarily happens, but, when there is that easy relationship and that it is possible for feedback to go in both directions. So when an educator needs to say to a family, hey, this is something we've noticed and what we're thinking about this, and vice versa, when the parent is able to say, this is happening and this is what I'm concerned about. I think that, parents being welcomed into the spaces, I think service leaders and educators openly communicating with parents before a problem necessarily
arises.
I think that there's sort of trust and safety go hand in hand, and I think most parents would, I genuinely believe most parents and most educators are incredibly trusting and reasonable, and they're in it. Everyone is there, they're trying to do their best. And I think that probably going more for open communication in every instance is going to get us further than trying to sort of stifle communication or pretend, downplay something, even if it's not an issue, pretending that it's not happening. I think those sorts of things create, if a parent is feeling like something isn't right and they feel that they're not being spoken to, that's a problem. I don't think, I think family inclusion is really how parents are welcomed into the space, how they're communicated with, not just the formal channels of here's the newsletter or here's the daily update, but it's having those open conversations. But again, what I would say is I know from my, our children are all at school and high school now, but educators and early childhood teachers having the ability to communicate with parents also does come down to the time and space they've got in a day. And if you've got a service that's running with waivers, with minimal staff, with not, and we know there are legitimate staff shortages, that is going to put pressure on the ability for any educator or any service to be kind of open to those ways of communicating with families. And that's a problem.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much for that, Georgie. And lots of people today have talked about that communication and that open communication. What I'd like to do now is bring all our panellists back to the screen and invite Tina to thank you all.
That has been an incredibly rich conversation, and I really do hope that our participants have actually really taken away a lot from each of our incredible speakers. So I would love to thank each of you for your incredible expertise and what you have brought, and for making yourselves readily available at such short notice. I know how incredibly time poor everybody is, let alone our sector leaders and experts. And Minister Winton has shared her apology, as she did need to rush off for another filming, and we all know how busy ministers are. But let me just reassure you, it's actually been incredibly comforting to have the minister so actively engaged. And what that allows us, of course, we can't have every minister here. We would love that, but we'd actually probably never get a word in edgeways if that was going to be the case. But what it allows us to do is actually have a minister who's actually going to bring what has come out of this conversation into that meeting with all of the education ministers that is happening towards the end of August. So all of these takeaways will be put into a debrief document for the minister. She will also receive the final recording. But she was here up until only about 10 minutes ago, but has just had to jump off because we've gone a little bit over time. So we thank the minister for her attendance and commitment, and for restructuring her week to actually be here with us. And thank you again to each of our panel members. I don't know if anybody's got anything final they would like to add before we wrap up with Connie. All good. But thank you to each of you, and thank you to those experts that would like to provide any links and resources that we will add to our resource pack, Connie.
Yes. So thank you again to all our panellists. It's been an amazing experience listening to you all talk. And just to confirm for everybody that you will receive a copy of this recording, a resource pack, and a feedback survey via email in the next week or so. Thank you once again for joining, and I'll just wish you all a farewell.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, everyone. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.
No worries. Okay.